Hi, welcome everyone. This is Vanu Deschetti. I'm the event tech advocate here at EVA for virtual conferences and registration. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on SSO. Just a little housekeeping before we begin. Everyone will be muted, but if you have any questions or would like to share something with us, definitely feel free to put that in the chat or use the Q&A feature here in Zoom. We love doing these webinars. Every time we learn something new and we test and try it out, we like to share that with you. But today's topic is a little bit more on the technical side. It's SSO. It's something that we are very good at doing, all things technical. And I've actually got one of our experts that we work very closely with over at Aplusify, which does Salesforce Managed Services. They do a lot of work with SSO. So thank you, Neeraj, for joining us today.
Giving me this opportunity, Veena. Looking forward for it.
Great. You know, in the last year or so with the pandemic, a lot of meeting planners have gone virtual and have, really looked at their online experience from registration to how that translates into the virtual conference platform as well. And one of the things that comes up a lot is about single sign-on. What can they do to have their members use that same username and password that they use for all of the other things they already use in the association? Can you tell us a little bit about, let's maybe start from the very beginning and tell us what exactly is single sign-on?
I think single sign-on as, if you see the literal meaning, it means signing on to multiple things with one user ID and password. So as an example, we can take that you join an organization and you are given your email ID and password. Now, there may be n number of systems that your organization may be using. You may have to apply leaves on an ERP system. You have to maybe log into the finance system to see your salary slip. So that single user ID and password, which is your email ID and password as well, how about using that email and ID and password to access all the systems? So you don't have to remember different user IDs and passwords. And as soon as you log into ERP, if you are already logged into your email, your ERP will not ask for any user ID and password, and you will be automatically logged in. So that is the convenience that it provides to everyone. Where you log in once and you can access multiple systems through a secured network. And I think it's very important to understand that when we say single sign-on, it's secured because all the information that is being passed on into different system is encrypted and is secured. So literally it is signing on to multiple systems through a single user ID and password.
Now, Neeraj, just to kind of maybe bring it to everyday applications, I'm used to using single sign. I'm lazy to try to remember 100 different passwords. I use SSO. A lot of times I think about when I do online shopping, like if I go to Amazon and I can go in and I can sign on with my Google ID or even any of my social media. Is that considered single sign-on?
Yes, that is considered single sign-on. So there are multiple options that different service providers provide. So if you go to your shopping, right, to any online shopping websites, they generally give you an option to either sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, sign in with any other social networking sites that you may be accessing. So what in fact is happening is your information. Again, when I say information, that is secured information and not all the information. A part of the information is being exchanged between two systems. And through that user ID and password, which is your maybe either your Google ID and password or Facebook ID and password, is used to provide you those services so that you don't have to remember user ID and passwords for all the online shopping that you have to do. So that is a single sign-on.
So that same application, so like when you sign in with a Facebook or a social media or Google, that's called an identity provider, correct?
Correct. So there are two things, right? So there is something called the service provider, and there is another called identity provider. So service provider is the uh, company that is actually providing you services, right? So you want to log into a shopping site, right? So that is your service provider. So you want to log into Amazon.com. So that is your service provider. And it says that if you want to log in, you can log in with providers, right? So they are authenticating you to log into service provider using their authenticity, which they will transfer to the service provider. So Amazon is the service provider, and Facebook or the Google Mail that you are using, that is the identity provider.
So for a lot of meeting planners that work for associations or nonprofits, they may be using an association management system or a CRM. So in this case, their registration system would be the service provider that you're talking about, and then their AMS or CRM would be their identity provider. Is that correct?
That is true. So maybe you want to log into your CRM, right? So identity provider would be your AMS, right? Through which you are actually the member of that association or member of that nonprofit. So that user ID and password is your identity provider, and the service that you are referring to, whether you're logging into Salesforce or any other CRM, that would be your service provider.
I think what I like about that is that the members are already used to engaging with whether it's that AMS system or their community portal. They're already used to logging in there and that interface and that password. They may have already saved it onto their laptop or computer in their secret password settings. But it's nice that they can just easily go with that same behavior. It's not like they have to remember something else. And then it's also secure, right? I mean, no matter what, a meeting planner wants to make sure that whatever registration system they're using or their virtual conference platform is secure. But this adds another layer of security, right? Because we're using what the organization has already vetted to be secure.
So, I was giving you an example. So, if I'm logging into my company's ERP system or any other ERP system using my company email ID or password, right? So, you know that your company's email ID and password is secured because it's going through a firewall. So, and even if you have saved it and you say log in with my company's ID and password, and it takes you to that another system, only very limited information, which may be your first name or last name, and maybe a secure token is passed on. And obviously, when it is passed, it is encrypted so that there is no hacking in between. So information is safe, and that is a very small part of the information that is shared with the service provider by the identity provider.
That's great. And then, so, we talked a lot about, having a registration system as the service provider, and then having your identity service providers, which is your AMS or the social media. But your registration system can also be an identity provider, correct? Like you can maybe perhaps create an account on your registration system, and that's somehow done an SSO integration with your virtual conference platform. Can that be done?
That can be done. So your identity provider can be anyone, right, who has actually implemented that SSO. So if you say that your AMS can be your identity provider, it can be. So it will save your user ID and password. And there is some exchange of information that is agreed between two parties. So they agree that we will pass on this information to you and we will get back this information. And that is totally secured. So any system can be your identity provider, which is authenticating you based on some algorithms at the backend, right? So your service provider can also be your identity provider in many cases.
Okay, so now we know what an SSO is. Before I begin to actually do the integration, what are some things that a meeting planner probably needs to think about before actually doing the or activating an SSO?
So I think before activating an SSO, you need to understand what technology you are actually planning, because there are a lot of identity providers in the market that you can actually use. You can use identity providers like OpenID. You can use something called SAML, which is actually security assertion markup language, or you can use OAuth. So there are 3 or 4 identity providers which are actually available. So you need to understand, and everything works the same, right? They all provide encryptions. Implementation for all this is pretty same because they lie on a standard encryption technology. So you can use any of these and just figure out what information needs to be exchanged between the 2 systems that we are trying to implement SSO on. And then it's just some configuration settings that you need to do, and then you are all done, ready to go.
And when you're talking about these configuration settings, I know as an attendee, when I go to register and I'm using SSO, it's very seamless, right? I can just, you press a button, you put in your username, your password, and you're in. Is it that simple for an organization to implement that, or is there more work involved?
So when we are talking about entering a user ID and password and clicking on a button, that is something that an end user is seeing, right? But if you talk about technicalities, there is something involved called information sharing between the 2 parties, the identity provider and the service provider. So the service provider will have to enter some information that identity provider will provide about their user IDs and the user information, which would be very limited. And then they will give some kind of URLs where it would be redirected once the authentication is done. So an example, you may say that if you log in through your registration process with your registration user ID and password, and you want to enter the virtual conferencing platform, so your registration site would provide some information to the virtual conferencing platform about its users, right? So that, I think this diagram typically explains that process. So you fill in your login credentials, and then at the back end, what happens is as soon as you enter the virtual conferencing platforms and you say, I want to register or I want to log in into the virtual conferencing platform. So what it does is it actually passes some information to your authentication or the identity provider site, which validates that information and passes that, yes, this user is authenticated and you are able to log in into the virtual conferencing platform. So everything at the front end is seamless, but there is a bit of information exchange that has to be done at the back end, which is not so tough, and the implementation is not at all difficult. It's just some settings that have to be done at both the ends.
Now, it's been my experience in reviewing different types of systems that are out there, registration and virtual conference. Not every system offers this, offers SSO, whether it's for Google or social media or for an AMS. So that's something definitely to watch out for, to make sure that if that's something you're interested in, that your 2 systems can talk to each other. In terms of information that's coming over, one of the things that was a very valuable lesson for me learning about this process is the information that actually does come over. You know, I think in the very beginning, when I first started working with SSO, I had an assumption that, oh, great, if I'm logging into my system, I'm automatically capturing all this data and it's going to come back over into my registration system. But that's not the case, right?
The case, like I told you, it's very, very limited information that is passed on about the user, right? Because the identity provider makes sure that the information is secured within its database. So the basic information is passed on, which may be your first name, last name, and the security token, which is all encrypted. So these are the 2 or 3 details that are passed on. Neither your email ID is shared, neither your phone numbers, all this information is actually very secured in your database and is never meant to be transferred for SSO. SSO does not require that information.
It's almost like going to Disney World these days. You've got that fancy little Disney watch. I don't know if you've seen that, but once you get your ticket and you've got this band, you can get into the Disney park and just roam around without ever having to bring out your credit card again or showing identification. That band that has all of that encrypted information is kind of your pass. And that's kind of how I see SSO. So it's just validation that this person exists and should have access to the system, correct?
That's correct, right? It's a very fair example to say that you tie that band in any theme park, a fully paid band, and then you go to any rides or any museums that you want to, right? So I think a lot of enterprises are doing that because it's very customer centric, because no one wants to take out his credit card every time and pay, right? They want to do it once and then enjoy full facilities with that band or the information that they have. And similarly with SSO, you log in once to your identity provider's site, and then wherever you want to go, it's just a click of a button.
Well, it seems like not only is it a smart way to go for security, but I think it's an expectation that technology is giving everyone. Now, every time you go online, you have that opportunity to do SSO. And it only seems natural that associations, conferences, and nonprofits can adapt to that same kind of UI experience of offering them that same online experience that they may get when they go shopping on Amazon or looking at magazine articles or things like that. Now, what about an organization that wants to go beyond just validation? They actually want to bring information over, like pre-filled forms and things like that. Can that be done through SSO, or is that done through a different type of integration?
So SSO does not provide you that pre-filled information, because when you are talking about pre-filled information, it means getting that data from the database and storing it in your fields as pre-filled fields, right? So SSO just helps you authenticate that this is a user who is authenticated from our end, and he is ready to log into your system without entering user ID and password. So if you have to get the pre-filled information, right, you need to integrate those two systems using APIs. So SSO does not have anything to do with that pre-filled information, because it works on very limited information between the two systems.
So if I'm going to do an SSO, I shouldn't expect for anything to come back. It's just to say this person has the authority to come into my registration system, unless I do an AMS integration or of some sort, right, to bring in that information.
That's true.
Okay. So once I've done SSO and I'm ready to start accepting registrations, is testing something that's important in this process, and what does that look like?
Yeah, testing is very important in this entire process, because what you're trying to do is making sure that the correct information is being passed on to the identity provider. Because if you're not passing the correct information of the user to the identity provider, it will not get validated, and then the logins will start failing. So it's important to understand that right information is being passed on to the identity provider, and you have got the right kind of token, a security token or an authentication token back from the identity provider, which tells you that the authentication is successful. And for that, I think it's important that the information that both the parties agree upon would get exchanged, be signed off, and initial level of testing is done between the two systems to understand that the exchange flow and the right information is getting passed on between two systems. So I think that basic testing is necessary. And then once you have integrated, it's always good to test the entire SSO in one go. Maybe you could try. So if you've done SSO between just two systems, there are two systems, so then it's okay. If there are multiple systems, our recommendation would be to log in into multiple systems using that authentication process.
That sounds very complicated. Let's just stick with one at a time. What
Yes.
about so we've done all of that. Is there ever a situation where SSO is not appropriate for an organization? Is there ever a time that you would say, maybe this isn't right for this group or for this conference?
I don't think there are situations because SSO is quite secured. At the underlying layer, they use something called OAuth, which is a very strong design pattern for security. So there are no glitches in it. And we are not talking about passing any personal information about the users. We are just talking about the first name, last name, and a token which is associated with it, which is actually a secret key. So, and once you have done that, I think the life becomes very easy. So I don't think so, unless you are working on a very tightly secured system in defense, or maybe doing some projects where they say that even the first name and last name will not be shared. You don't want to pass any data through these sessions. I think that is where we can say that we don't want to use SSO, but most of the enterprises use SSO right now. And for virtual conferences, I don't see any risk attached to it.
It's really interesting. In this past year, between our registration and our virtual conference clients, I would say about 90% have used it, especially when used SSO. And I think the number one reason I heard from most of our clients is they just wanted to make it easy for their attendees. They're already adapting to this new virtual environment. They wanted to eliminate any barriers, any obstacles they may have to actually log in, which I thought was very thoughtful from a UI experience and for attendees. And I think as time goes, as technology advances, virtual conference platforms and registration platforms will naturally evolve and become better and more intuitive. I think it'll be even more important to try to create this unified experience across all the platforms that a member is using. So I'm very excited to learn a little bit more about SSO. I know it can be very technical, but I think it's important for meeting planners to understand exactly what is it, what is the value to it, how it can be secure. Thank you, Neeraj, very much for sharing all this information with us. Is there anything else you would like to share with us about SSO?
I think it's not a very complicated process like many of us think. The word SSO sounds like an alarm to everyone that it's quite because it involves authentication. It's a complicated process and it's hard to implement. But I would say that it's not a very complicated process to implement it in your organization. And even for virtual conferences, I think it will take you some time to understand and then implement it. But the benefits, I think, that your users or your attendees will get are multifold. So I think let's go for it. And especially in this virtual world where people are already so confused and tired, right? Let's make their life easier and prettier by using SSO.
Well, thank you so much, Neeraj. I think you summed it up really well. That's what we believe here at EVA. We believe in making life simple, making the job for the meeting planner a lot easier. We know you guys have a lot that's on your plate, and anything that we can do to make that easier for you so that you can focus on those relationships, the content, and what you really do really well, making that successful meeting happen. Thank you very much again, Neeraj, for joining us. This is Neeraj Garg. He's with Aplusify, focusing on Salesforce managed services for associations and nonprofits. Thank you for all the technical knowledge. Wanted to share with you all, we have another webinar coming up in February talking about AV equipment that you're going to need for your hybrid event. We're going to have a panel of AV experts joining us, and they're going to talk about if you wanted to, different types of hybrid events to keep it simple, or if you wanted to go advanced, what you're looking at, and to help you kind of with your planning, with your budgets. So I hope that you can join us. And this is Vinu Deschetti. I am the event tech here at EVA. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have any questions, we're happy to take them. You'll get an email from us with this presentation, the recording, and other resources. So hopefully it will be useful for you. Hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.